In a country where democracy is undermined, we cannot do social change. We make those in power stay in power, and we cannot do anything about it. We cannot solve the problems we want to solve. We cannot make vulnerable people solve the problems. We cannot destroy the structures that already harm other people. These are the things we in Proposition are trying to solve. Firstly, what I'm going to do in my speech, firstly on framing, secondly on a quick model, and thirdly on our arguments, firstly on a functional democracy, then explaining to you how we manage to evade democratic backsliding, how we make it more effective, and thirdly, on the third argument for my second speaker. With that said, directly into framing. Firstly, what is democratic backsliding? Firstly, it's a removal of checks and balances in government. This means for people in power, you can guarantee that people that are in power are going to be good, are going to comply with their voters' interests, etc. Without these checks and balances, this means these political people can do whatever they want. They can be corrupt as they want. There is no way to check in what they are doing. Secondly, on terms of law, which determines what interpretations can do. This means that if we have checks and balances in law, we can determine what things can be done by law, what things we cannot do. This guarantees two things. Firstly, that rights are not going to be violated. For instance, if I have a 51% majority in a country that says we should be terrorists and kill every single people, checks and balances allow these things to not happen. Or secondly, we allow that we save corruption in the sense that we protect people from corruption, we say corruption exists, and we can check those things in order to have mechanisms to avoid it in the future. We publicize those things. We tell corrupt people that they should not do some things. We put the police in front of them. We try to solve these things by checks and balances. Backsliding inherently destroys these mechanisms because it is what it is. Secondly, on civil society groups. Firstly, they have a lot of visibilization, they have power on the media, they are actively pushing narratives onto people to help other people. Secondly, they help vulnerable groups that need help because they were, firstly, structurally harmed, that is to say, ethnic groups that were damaged in the US naturally just because of their ethnicity. Two, people that are harmed in today's life because their civil rights are being violated. For instance, groups like feminist people that actively think they are being harmed by people or the structure that they have. Or secondly, trans people or people who, women that are actively harmed their rights simply because of the natural aspects they have. I think this is very problematic, and these groups try to tackle those problems by actively visualizing those problems and trying to solve them. Our model is very simple. Actively prioritizing, then trying to help in terms of resources and time to shift their advocacy from substantive policy goals to violations of democratic norms, like infringements on the independence of courts, removing constitutional safeguards, terms that are extremely important in society. First, before I go into my first argument, your POI.
In order for you to manifest your impact, you need to get people on the street. But when you tell them that they're government...
I'll explain that later in my first argument. Firstly, functional democracy, how we get it back. Firstly, on framing, why are functional democracies a precondition to social change? A, if societies cannot change the structure of the system by democratic ways, there is no change. There is a lack of another alternative. If I cannot vote for a president to save my to push my political goals, that is to say, to create the change that I need, because we are a minority and we cannot do those things, then we have no other ability to do those things. Secondly, social narratives are not enough to change these structures, because the only way you can make this reality is by policy. For example, abortion cannot be done if policies are not allowing it to be legal. If we do not have these measures, which we do not have with democratic backsliding, then we cannot achieve the change that we want. It is inherently good that we have a functional democracy because it helps the most vulnerable groups who do not have the votes for enough or do not have enough visibilization. Why is backsliding bad for these people? A, because it counters mechanisms to change people in power, because they keep in power. The natural alternative to democracy is autocracy. People stay in power, having even more power over time that we cannot throw out. Secondly, because it keeps people in power in the first place who control those narratives, and we do not allow change socially because they control social media, they control the narratives that a country has. We cannot have the social change, not even narratives. Now, how it affects everyone. Firstly, disregards the public interest of rights in favor of control. These politicians stay in control. It undermines what people actually want. And secondly, it disregards the principle of democracy, of fairness and transparency. When these people control the narratives, control the policy making, control what a country does, we cannot have any alternative to do something to change the system that is harming these people. Our mechanism to explain to you this is very simple. Why are these groups not effective in status quo? Firstly, the problems that they are tackling do not concern the majority. They see it as, for example, they see it as an alien to them. They do not familiarize with these problems. Or two, because it doesn't affect them. I think the majority of people are not concerned by abortion, for example, or by same-sex marriage, right? Because these things do not affect the majority. People do not care about it, and even if they cared about it, they do not endorse it or do not feel that it is a real problem. So they do not invest into those things. So that is to say, why are in our side more effective? Because democracy affects every single person. I think democracy, when we see that our values are underdetermined, when we cannot protect people from corrupt politicians, it affects every single person. So we move every person in a country to push for better policy, for pushing against democratic backsliding. This is a measure that makes it more effective. But why these groups are the ones that are able to do this? Because in a democracy that has democratic backsliding, when this happens, the majority of people are not aware that it happens, because the country naturally has the power of the narratives, has power over social media. This naturally shifts how these people in power make people believe what the things that they have. Even if they know there is backsliding, they do not know how to solve it, because naturally the governments do not publish how to solve those problems in order to stay in power. They push all their narratives to keep themselves in power. So why these groups are more effective? Because civil groups have the expertise in the political system. They are trained to do those things. They are naturally have the incentive to solve these problems, and they have the measures to do that. When the majority of people see these people as experts, they see there is a hope. Because even if they did know that it could exist, they do not have the power to do so. Your point.
If you claim that under backsliding the media is controlled, how do you even get these groups pushed into public prominence? The government will not let them.
There is a civilization of these groups by social media. There is control over narratives, because we see this all the time. We see these advocacy groups happening all the time. The thing is, it does not affect the majority. When people see this is a problem that has to be solved for everyone to receive benefits, we solve those things. What are the things we get back from this? Firstly, we avoid backsliding. This means we get back the checks and balances, so we control people who are corrupt into not being corrupt. We protect people that are not able to be protected because voters are bought, there is gerrymandering, for example. We solve those things. We also protect people from human rights violations or civil liberties. On to our second argument, which is very quick. Civil liberties. People lose the civil liberties when backsliding happens, because politicians that are corrupt and stay in power have a natural incentive to undermine them. Very simply because A, they believe those are the smaller groups. Secondly, there is no political agenda to help them. Thirdly, they have incentives to undermine them in favor of other groups that are the majority. We see this as politicians not endorsing abortion or for the sake of having more voters. This undermines the civil liberties that people may have, the natural constitutional rights that they may have. This undermines that. And if we do not solve this problem, which we do by the mechanism we already explained, we solve that problem only in proposition. With that said, I propose.
response on my speech in 3, 2, 1. The whole P1 speech is reliant upon this assertion that they get the government out. Insofar as we prove why the government, they don't remove the government, they cannot manifest any of their benefits. Two arguments in my speech. Firstly, on waiting out the storm. Secondly, about changing policy. But before that, two main points in setup. Firstly, who are we talking about in this debate? Notice these aren't dictatorships that have already taken control of their power, that control the media and all of these things. Rather, these are aspiring dictators. People like Vucic, Orban and Trump currently. These are leaders that can be thrown out in the next election if they lose their popularity. They're not full-on dictators like Bukele, which captured the whole country, they captured the judiciary and the media. Second point in setup then. How do these people get thrown out? Firstly, time, right? These people just retire as politicians, or they just literally die out. These people are old or will die soon. Secondly, there is external pressure. Things like sanctions put by other countries, or people within your union threatening to kick you out. For example, how European Union threatened to kick Poland out when they captured their judiciary. And thirdly, there's just internal betrayals. People in your own party want more power. What they do is they separate from your party and they have legitimacy to rally people. They literally they tell people, I'm like I'm like your party. I'm the same way your party used to be when they weren't corrupt, when they didn't capture power. Vote for me. Bottom line, we have sufficient mechanisms in status quo to get these people out of power, regardless of if we protest or not. Then, before my two arguments, rebuttal. Firstly, notice the whole P1 speech relies on getting the government out of power, but they never proved it. So, why they cannot get government out of power? Firstly, no one will actually go out and protest. They don't care if someone is an expert. They don't care if people are experts, because firstly, I'm unsure why these people are experts, and secondly, the politicians are talking. Why people won't protest? Firstly, these people are pro-government, right? These people need to get, this government need to get in power democratically. A lot of people support them. Secondly, there's a huge barrier to entry to take down the whole government, literally. I'm unsure why the average person thinks they can do it. Thirdly, these people are afraid to speak up, right? Insofar as this government is somewhat authoritarian, you suffer you fear suffering consequences like going into jail and all of these things. And lastly, this you yourself as as a social movement, you shift your priority, right? This means you lose support from your previous group, right? Like insofar as the feminist movement that doesn't talk about women's issues, rather they talk about democracy, you lose a lot of support from feminists who feel as if you betrayed them. Secondly, even if people do protest, the government doesn't care. They never showed us the mechanism why the government cares about appeasing people. The government can't appease people on their house because appeasing people means losing power, and on their house the government will never do that. Notice, even if the government, even if proposition gets government out of power, we can still get their policy impacts on our house. Before my first argument, I'll take that POI.
No, yeah, under Lord Chavez, Venezuela had significant democratic backsliding, and the next president that elected became a dictator, aka Maduro.
Okay, sure. I'm unsure how this is responsive to any of what I just said. First argument then, on waiting out the storm. Notice this is highly charitable argument. It functions on the presumption that proposition can get people onto the streets, even at their best, we win. Why do we think this is bad? Because of the backsliding spiral that protests cause. Notice, backsliding governments are not dictatorships and can still get thrown out in elections. They're scared of protests then, because these protests aren't about changing a law or policy, but fundamentally stripping power from the executive. Even if not many people protest, the government is still scared of them. Why? Because firstly, you're afraid that the protests will spread and grow even more, and secondly, you're afraid of the people watching at home and supporting the protests, still disagreeing with you as a government. What do then afraid leaders do on proposition? They consolidate power even more. They buy out media companies, they pay off judges, they try extra hard to rig elections. Notice the spiral mechanism here. On proposition, these actions supposedly cause more people to protest even more, which then causes the government to capture even more power, and the cycle just continues. Notice that this leads to a government which looks more and more like dictatorship, and it's impossible to throw it in the next elections because they are entirely fraudulent. They did capture the judiciary, they did capture the media. What is their comparative to this point? Notice our framing. We just wait out the natural mechanisms to sort themselves out and for these governments to naturally get thrown out of power. The government never has an incentive to do any on national housing. The government never has any extra incentive to do power grabs on national house because they aren't threatened by these people. What is the impact? On proposition, full-on dictatorships spiral. Why is this bad? Firstly, because it's just less democratic order, right? Like insofar as these people become full-on dictatorships, democracy is thrown out, which obviously is very important. Like why? Because every single person has like a different preference. They don't want their governments to meet. The government controls these people to a high degree. Thus, we need an agency to control the government back. This is lost in proposition. But secondly, human rights abuse, right? Like insofar even though this cannot happen in the status quo because there's like this extra pressure for so on and so on. Once these people become full-on dictatorships, there's nothing they can be do to remove them from power. Thus, they can do whatever they want. They can do human rights abuses. All of the minorities, the proposition talking about needing to have them suffer on proposition. Second argument then about changing policy. First burden. Why a lot of people go out and protest on national house? Because these issues are really proximate to them, right? Like insofar as you're a woman, whether or not you can have abortion, whether or not femicide is legal, is very proximate to you. And they change your life for the better insofar as you do win the fight. And obviously we have a very organized structure with a lot of people that can coordinate these protests. You feel as if you're not alone because you're working under an organized structure. Why do then governments listen to and make concessions on national house? Firstly, the government just doesn't want protests. This is an inherently bad thing for you as a government because it feels like it feeds unrest in the streets. You may get like a lot of negative media attention and so on. Secondly, the government doesn't want these protests to escalate to being anti-government. Insofar as the government doesn't give concessions on national house, people are much likely to be unhappy with the government itself. Thus, protesting the government is something it doesn't want. And thirdly, they don't want to lose like a lot of voters, right? Insofar as we characterize that these governments can lose the next elections, they want to try and avoid doing anything they can to like piss off extra people, so they make concessions. Crucially, all of this works even if the policy isn't supported by the majority, like proposition wants to characterize. Meaning, we get policy change, we get things like helping women, recognizing femicide, to legalizing abortion. We help impoverished people, for example, by making social policies, making accessible housing, and so on. What's the propositions comparative to this point? I think two things. Firstly, at their best, they just get all of these things later, right? They just don't protest for these social issues, so the government doesn't have anything to concede to. They just get these issues later. But I think realistically, they never get these policies changed. Why? Because one social movement frame getting the government out as a priority, and they do it successfully on their house, they lose all momentum for any other policy change, right? Like this is it. You won the battle. There is nothing to fight anymore. This is it. The fight is over. Nothing else matters. Thus, they can't drive people and motivate them to fight for all of these other issues that we're still talking to about as important, because they feel as if they just did the most important thing they can, because that's how they frame it. So for all these reasons, please oppose.
Panama, I'm going to begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panama, the amount of tension in seeing opposition's case is so much that I could literally hang the entire building with this tension. Why? I'm going to explain to you through 3 points. Firstly, on those so-called natural mechanisms and why it's ineffective, just based on the things that they have said. Secondly, on specifically on how protests are and civil rights groups are a much more effective mechanism to bring back and restore democracy. And thirdly, on the goals of these groups and how we are more likely to accomplish them in the long term, right? So firstly, they tell us that, oh my God, there's a bunch of natural mechanisms that exist in status quo. For example, international pressure regarding Poland. For example, the fact that people don't want their rights being taken away, etc. That create this pressure that will fix itself. Let me tell you, panel, that this is not enough. Because firstly, the reason why there's democratic backsliding often, a lot of the time, is because many people aren't aware of the intricate political systems that will cause and the consequences that will cause democratic backsliding, right? They aren't aware of what actions exactly, for example, how if the government passing a new law will cause the political system to change slightly in a way that will cause them to lose certain rights, that will cause the judiciary to be less independent. Most people don't know about this. Civil rights groups, though, have the expertise to know about this, and therefore, they're the ones that are most affected, right? But then secondly, they tell us that there's international pressure, and look at what happened to Poland. Let me tell you, panel, that what happened to Poland was that people took to the streets and started protesting. Not that the European Union said, Poland needs to fix itself, because when that happened, what that created was that when you exert international pressure, people view this as a violation of their sovereignty, as their democracy. Government is then able to frame this as something that as foreign intervention. Hence, all other international mechanisms are extremely ineffective when it comes to these sort of things. What is most likely going to happen when these civil rights groups don't do anything is like what happened to Venezuela, like I pointed out in POI, in which these dictators, they don't just resign suddenly, and it's not like it's a series of democratic backsliding that causes one person to be able to consolidate so much power, and that as a result they're able to stay in power for life, and therefore they don't give up. They don't give up in the next election because Maduro had so much power because of democratic backsliding that they were able to rig all consecutive elections, right? I think democratic backsliding, when you don't stop them at the point in which it is on the tipping point, on the point that is the easiest to stop, it becomes uncontrollable, and that is what's going to happen to teen opposition's world. Before I move on to my next point, your point?
Yeah, groups cannot act alone. They need to convince people. How are they able to convince people?
I think they're able to convince people because it's not that people support democratic backsliding, because that is against their interest. Democratic backsliding it involves the concentration of power in specific groups. It means that power will be taken away from your average voter. Power will be taken away in the majority, right? I think then, therefore, the reason for democratic backsliding is simply that people are most likely unaware, right? Why are they unaware? Because they're simply not familiar with the political system, in which we saw through the fact that civil rights groups are experts in these political systems, because they have for decades fought against these political systems, trying to get more rights and more and better conditions for these vulnerable groups. They are expert in this area, right? So then why are protests more effective? And here's where there's a significant tension in their responses, right? Because they tell us that protests aren't effective because governments don't care about them. Let me tell you, they are effective because, like, 2 minutes later, they said governments don't like protests, governments are afraid of losing supporters, so that doesn't make sense. You can't have your cake and eat it too, right? Secondly, they tell us that protesters we will lose if these groups start advocating for things like democracy, they will lose their core supporters. But we had already told you that this is something that affects everyone, and that democratic backsliding is especially bad for vulnerable groups, because vulnerable groups are groups that already have very little power in the status quo. So they're the groups that are most likely going to be targeted and have their power taken away and concentrated in real groups. This looks like, for example, autocratic governments slashing social and economic assistance. This looks like, I think, government deciding to stop social programs. I think all of this means is that vulnerable groups are most likely to be heavily affected by them. And so I think it doesn't matter that feminism, that the most feminist person really cares about feminism. I think if there's democratic backsliding, most supporters recognize that it is a threat to everyone that we need to solve, that it is a precondition, like our first speaker mentioned, in order to achieve this. So therefore, that's why there will be enough support on these protests. So then, I think that why is protest the most effective way to get there? Because, like they've mentioned, the fact that governments care about protests, right? I think governments that is attempting to impose democratic backsliding, like they said, still have supporters, still have some level of supporters, right? And what this means is that there's ultimately something for those politicians to lose if they don't appear well. And I think this is where protests do two very important things. Firstly, protests increase the visibilization of these issues. It means that you increase the likelihood that that their supporters are going to be convinced, and politicians know this, and hence that is why they, based on their mechanism, say governments don't like protesters, because then this brings us the ability to change their views and hence turn their supporters against them. They're afraid of losing that. That's why these protests are effective. But then secondly, I think what happens in these protests is also that it disrupts socioeconomic functioning, right? It means that these protests are blocking the streets. It means that there's certain economic detriment that is happening. It means that the government doesn't look good because it looks like they've lost control of the situation. I think what this means is that when when there's a lot of protest, you're perceived as an ineffective government, and hence you lose your supporters that these governments need for the next election. That's how these governments fall. That's how these governments, in a still functional democracy, despite democratic backsliding, get voted out. That's what happened in Poland. Don't let the opposition fool you, panel. Before I move on to the next point, PI.
Even if all of this is true, the government can't make concessions because that necessarily means getting weaker and removing.
But it doesn't matter, because as long as we make people more aware of the issue, it means that we're more likely to get them voted out sooner. It means that they have less time to do as much damage to democracy. Because while they may tell you these issues resolve themselves, what I'm telling you, panel, is one more year of democratic backsliding is one more year we are closer to a dictatorship. It means that all of these problems get way worse. It means that one more year where visibilization is harder because the government has one more year to consolidate narratives, to control the media, to control the judiciary, all of these things, right? I think that is why the right to protest, that's why visibilization is so important this way. That's why we win this part. But then thirdly, on goals, right? I think I'd like to point out that I think this is implicitly agreed upon, that you need a democracy in order to achieve your goals, right? I think this is simple, right? Because democracy provides you the stability and check and balances for it to make sure that the goals that you make into law actually persist through time. Because in an autocracy, a government can just change their mind the next day. A government can just eliminate social money extremely easily. In a government, there are clear and certain processes for you to go through, making these laws more certain. What happens then is that I think we are more likely to achieve this in our world, because firstly, we prevent democratic backsliding, meaning that the laws we pass are more likely to stay through time. But then secondly, by aligning ourselves with an issue that will affect your average voter, you gain social capital through them, right? You improve their perception of yourself. It means that whatever goals you want to achieve, you're more likely to convince them because they already have a better perception of you, because they view you as an ally, as someone that cares about their issues and not your own as well. That is why at the end of the day, we still see more goals accomplished on our side. We win this debate.
All right, thank you. And now I invite the second opposition speaker.
Just a second, set up lights. Start my speech at my first word. I'm going to win this debate through two cases in my speech. First, we're going to talk about the best case of opposition, where we win on those grounds, and this is the more likely case about how they never actually proved, please look at your flows, they never actually give us incentive where people will actually go to protest. We give you 4 mechanisms why people will be afraid, whether they're going to be anti-government, etc. So we don't see how they actually manifest any of their benefits. So first, let's talk about the best case of proposition, where we imagine that Panama succeeded in actually proving that people will go out and protest. I want to tell you that incentive to consolidate power on both sides for politicians exists. Because but important to note that once a politician consolidates power to the point of becoming a dictator, it becomes impossible and too late to actually change someone who is in power, because they capture the media and they capture everyone. So why is it that doesn't happen on opposition as quickly? We want to tell you that they're going to be afraid to actually do and capture the power as quickly on our side, because they're going to be afraid of it not working, because they didn't spend enough time on capturing the judiciary that can go against them. They don't have allies that will turn back on them because they're afraid that it's going to be too quick, they're going to get blamed and just thrown out. Which means that on our side, they're not going to be capturing the power as much, so we don't have dictators outright on our side when we're waiting this out. It's still going to be, they're still going to have some media that you'll be able to have visibility. You're still going to have some ways to actually remove this person from power in the next election. You have an overwhelmingly amount of people against them, or you have a overwhelming amount of people who are against the economic situation because of the sanctions we told you in one of our mechanisms how we can keep these people out. Props comparative is forcing politicians to circumvent that fear. Do people go out and protest? Which means that people are going to have to, these politicians are going to have to crack down on these people. Because notice, protests don't work on their side, because if politicians were to concede to some of the concessions that these people want in their process, they have to necessarily remove power from themselves, because the problem is judiciary, because the problem is the consolidating of power. Politicians have no other way to actually get to their power. They cannot concede on their side because they want the power, which means on their side, the protests are unable to work. The only their comparative is increased crackdowns, which means because of these increased crackdowns, they consolidate the power more quickly, which means there's no way for external pressure to actually be able to get these politicians out. There's no way for internal pressure, etc. Because they're going to consolidate the power so quickly, we have irreversible damage on their side. On our side, if we have this process slowly, which I've proven to why it will happen on our side, you have time to actually reverse this and remove democratic backsliding. So our comparative is just to wait it out. We give you 3 mechanisms of why we get out of power. Out of power on our side, which we told you that you have external pressure on which they responded at first. People are not aware of these things being a problem, but if they're not aware, how will people protest actually on your side? I don't see how you're able to actually they will actually put these people on the street. But they also say both that people cannot understand backsliding, and that's why natural mechanisms don't work, but also say that all groups care about backsliding and see the impacts of it, so they'll go out and protest. They cannot pick both. We say that these things are going to be, people are going to be aware, and there's a possibility of external pressure happening because the media is not captured yet, which means that the external actors can be the ones that threaten you to kick you out of the union, the ones saying they'll have you economic sanctions, which means that people are going to be so disappointed and against the politician on our side. Well, we still have some kind of democracy, just not captured the judiciary. You'll be able to kick him out on our side. But I want to get to note, they just never responded, they actually responded to our other mechanisms of a way that we can actually remove this person out of power on our side. We told you just a simple time is the one that actually removed this person from power, because after him there's not going to be someone charismatic enough or someone who's going to consolidate the power the same way. And we told you about internal pressure, how people are going to internal pressure, how people are going to just go against the back of the main leader to actually consolidate some power themselves, which means they'll have to see themselves, frame themselves as someone who is more democratic. So they're going to go on protest and be against the consolidating of power, so they can have a chance to actually go on elections and win them themselves when they actually remove this person from power. An additional natural way to throw them out is just being a bad leader. You have bad economy, you have unhappy voters on their side. You have to be a bad leader, otherwise you wouldn't have to capture power, which means on their side, on our side, you will necessarily have a way to throw these people out. Which means the best case of opposition is that people go out and protest just makes them more has more crackdowns on their side and actually consolidates power even quicker. Next thing I want The next thing I want to talk about is their point about like protests are good because of the visibility. We told you that we have the knowledge because people know themselves, the media is still not captured, and PROP never actually proved why supporters of government will actually switch just because they have this specific knowledge, since we already told you that these people are very like anti-government. But now let's talk about the more likely case of proposition, is that first that people won't go out to protest, which is a logical prerequisite for any of their content to actually manifest. We told you a lot of things. That first that people are like very pro-government because this person was actually voted into power. This is the point that I told you before, that even if they have some visibility and actually find out that this person just captured judiciary, we don't see why people will believe it, since people are very pro-government in these kinds of countries because they voted this person in and there's some media capture, which means there is some propaganda that makes these people pro-government. We told you that there's a too high barrier to entry because we're talking about going against and protesting whole institutions, courts and constitution. People are going to be too hopeless because problem is too big for you to solve. How you're afraid to speak up against the government. How there's a current shift of these organizations to talk about gay poverty before, but now feel like but people who were mobilized before feel like these organizations are not consistent because they changed their messaging, and because this is not proximate to you, they actually get like no people going out and protesting. Before I move on, I'll take a point.
Yeah, you mentioned that you will wait it out, but let me tell you, big, impactful, and urgent things are what cause people to wake up. For example, holding the ozone layer, we were able to fix that super fast. But small things that happen over time, people don't pay attention to them, like climate change, because they think it won't be as disastrous as they think.
Okay, but on our side, we told you this doesn't respond to any of our mechanisms. Because the judiciary, people can see, and other outside actors can see that your politicians are captured, the judiciary is captured, I don't see how this is responsive to any of our case. So we want to tell you that the unique benefit of our side was our second argument, because first we told you that we get protest on our side, because this is something that is proximate to people, because you're a mother, because abortion and poverty, this is something that you see people who are poor on the street, you poor yourself, or you're a woman that actually faces femicide, you have gay friends or gay people who actually face all of these problems, which means it's something that is proximate to people, and we are the ones that actually get protests on our side. And on our side, we get concessions because the government can actually concede on these things because it doesn't take away from their power. That is the delta and the unique benefits of our side. Because on our side, while we're waiting the storm while we're waiting out the storm, we're the ones that actually get all of the benefits and all of these policies that we want to talk about on our side. While on proposition, these organizations will lose momentum, and even if they prove somehow democratic backsliding, they will never actually gain all of our policies because these organizations are going to lose momentum, or because of the really radical shift of no longer actually talking about problems like gay rights or abortion. They're going to lose followers because of the radical shift, which means they're going to have like no mobilized people fighting for these policies on their side. That is a unique benefit we also talk to you about from opposition. So please oppose.
I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I think there's been a problem in this debate and something that opposition has not been able to prove then, because note that both of their speeches take a lot of time explaining why is that first is that politicians care about power and they don't want to be taken out, but then they say that they care about voters and that they're going to concede some of the power, that because for all the impacts of them to work, for them to actually be able to get all these social movements, then the politicians would need to concede those things. I think there's a great tension in this debate. But second, because they actually never really explain to you why there's actually incentives for the politician to hear about all these problems that are controversial on itself. Like, let's say, abortion. They try to minimize us by explaining on all their second about why we won't have power, but note that first, they never explain why there's actually going to be more support on their side, knowing that there's probably going to be less people things, but second is when there's actually gonna be structural changes. So the first thing I want to do is an effectiveness that I think is the main wash that it came down in this debate, and I will try to fix this. Okay, first, why is there actually effectiveness in our side and not on their side? Because first, I think it's because of a narrative debate, right? Because I think this is a problem that affects everybody. Note that this is not something like I as a man, I'm not affected by feminism. I think there's little incentives for me to actually want to go out in the street and support the cause, right? Because this is not something that is actively affecting me. But note that when we talk about a democratic issue, then we can turn this narrative as civil groups trying to oppose us after trying to take our rights away. I think when you have strong narratives like that, like corruption, like politicians being undermining our rights and undermining vulnerable groups, then I think that's something that probably more of the majority will be able to appeal to. Why is this important in this debate, and why does support actually make structural changes? Because note, panel, that it's not the same thing in a protest to say that this is something that they never explain why it's more effective, and this comes to comparative. And their side, if it's true that problems like feminism or having abortions are pros that will probably have that support because there's less people being identified, then I think the comparative it's what? And 2,000 people and millions of people on our side. I think then the effectiveness of this debate actually comes on our side, because I think then all the mechanisms that they try to say are more effective on our side. Because note that then our tension actually makes more sense, because I think it's true what they say. Because I do think that politicians don't want to lose power, but I think because they don't want to lose power is the reason why there's actually going to be some concessions. Because no, panel, that if I'm a politician that literally doesn't want to do and that doesn't want to concede anything and are gonna do extremely unpopular things, that definitely means that in next election I'm probably not gonna be elected. I think there's incentives for me to concede those things. But second, because of all the mechanisms that opposition wants to frame us, right? That when when there's major protests, it comes economical backlash, there's major protests, there's a lot of loose voters, now you don't want to disrupt in these groups. I think because of all these things, is that probably in comparison, our effectiveness matter is probably gonna be better, because if you weigh it, this means no thank you that we'll have more support. This probably means that there will be more pressure for the governments to be able to do this. But second, why is the democratic then? It should be the path of victory to win this debate. That I think it's another thing that it's not very certain. I think then we need to understand why is democratic important for our case and their case, because note that the democracy itself is a precondition to actually be able to achieve all those benefits that opposition wants to claim. Because if it's true that we have political backlash and in opposition we're not going to do anything about it, then I think it's more likely on their side that things like happen, like concentration of powers in certain areas. Like, I don't want to push in politics even if the majority wants to do it because I have a concentration of power, or let's say silencing people when they protest, because of the same thing that institutions over time becomes more and more unstable because we are not doing anything about it. I think this is bad, because if it's true that if it's true that we're not going to actively prioritize these things, then I think we lose a bigger harm that probably in the future that institutions become weaker and probably we will have mechanisms to be able to fight this. I think it's more effective when we actually recognize this since the beginning, because this means that we actually can fight it before it's too late. So why does this actually matter in this debate, and how should you weigh it? I think first, it's simple that now, when we actually have democratic, I think first we have mechanisms like, let's say, voting. Example, now that we have if feminism went to push for another thing, I think now we have spaces to do it, because this is how democracy looks like. But second, because I think we also have check and balances. And why this is important in this debate? I think because now we won't have probably a president who will disrupt all these social groups that probably won't benefit him. I think when we have check and power, this limits the power that a politician or a president has. I think this is good, because this means that the level of impact of social groups will probably be less on our side, because when we fix democracy and when we have stronger institutions, then I think things like, let's say, civil rights, like having less civil rights will probably happen more on their side. So I think in case, I think it's more importantly that we actively advocate for these things, because I think note in this debate, it's not that we're leaving it completely and we'll never engage with social groups, but I think right now when we have backsliding, it's important that we advocate it, because we understand as groups that we actually have to have a precondition to this. And third, because note that I think it's very false, a thing that they want to say that it won't be effective because people will think that you are that feminisms, when you see that they're not actively prioritizing, they will leave the group. I think this is false. First, because note that feminisms in the status quo fight for changes in structure because they recognize that this is a path to victory to actually be able to make all those changes. So I think it's very likely that when we see that it's a problem that is affecting everybody, and feminisms and all these social groups know that this is something that they have to make better, to actually have all these benefits, then I think it will be something that we all will fight for. So I think effectiveness, we end up winning on our side, but
pure and perfect democracy is not a prerequisite for our policies. Because we're still in a democratic backsliding country, we just capture democracy, not a dictatorship. Concessions have to happen to remain in power and get voted in. When elections are won on thin margins, they will make these concessions.
Yes, exactly. I think there's a very big tension on opposition side that they actually never want to characterize. I think on our side there will be some concessions, and I think this is good because this means that the effectiveness matter will probably be more. But let's do the comparative on right side on why is there actually less effectiveness on their side. I think first is because note that first, when we have political backsliding, it means that now politicians can get away with things like, let's say undermining political groups and saying that it's that they're disrupting the places, so they shouldn't go out to protest. I think second, it gives them the vulnerable groups are more affected now because it leaves them less capacity to actually be able to vote or do all those things. I think then on our side we end up winning because we prove to you that the democratic principle is fundamental to actually be able to solve all these problems that opposition wants to say. But second, because just note that we already proved to you some things, opposition actually never ends up proving any points of them, because first, they never prove effectiveness, second, they never prove why should we actively prioritize them in cases in favor of democracy. And I think for all these reasons, I am so proud to
Thank you, and now I'd like the third opposition speaker.
Something over, sorry. Okay, I assume I'm audible like this. Great. I'll start my speech at my first word. A case doesn't have to be tense to be bad. Regrettably, in this debate, proposition is so under-mechanized, they never showed us the opportunity to develop significant tensions in our case. We think this is a severely worse thing than a perhaps, even though it's false, tense case on our side. I'm going to prove how proposition one is debate for two main things. First of all, a point of housekeeping. Secondly, going for the two most relevant clashes. First of all, on housekeeping, I think at this point of the debate, both sides do agree that these countries are not yet dictatorships, thus these leaders can in some way be thrown out in the next election if an enough percentage of the population is convinced. Notice the impact of this house on the debate. They can't just claim that on our side, out of nowhere, these leaders will capture power immediately. It's very risky to try to capture power. What if not all facets of the government go along with you? What if the judiciary disagrees and decides to throw you out? What if some other members close to you in the government feel it's not yet the time and you're overestimating yourself and they try to secretly cool you behind the back by getting public support on their side? What needs to happen in order for these governments to transition to true dictatorships is to give a great incentive to these leaders to finally collectivize, or rather to finally consolidate power. Only proposition gives this incentive in the status quo. They can't just claim this is something that happens out of thin air on our side. First clash then, on throwing out this crooked government. Notice the prerequisite to this clash. Some amount of public convincing needs to happen in this debate. Both sides kind of agree this likely happens through protests. We think protests are good because they just get people visibly angry on the streets, and secondly because because they're able to affect a large amount of the population, because you feel like there's a huge community with you, because you feel like other people support you, and even if you're at home, you feel like even if you don't care significantly about these issues, other people care significantly about these issues. I think both sides agree here. What are proposition's attempts here at positive content there? They just have this broad point on civil groups being the likely agent to throw these governments out by, I don't know, providing experts who educate the public, who convince the public on their side. We think this is wrong for 5 reasons. First of all, it's just a lie. Experts have no reason to be the face of these organizations because they're not charismatic. They're pen pushers, they're nerds. Obviously, it's politicians who will be the ones communicating directly with people and convincing them. Thus, even if people are uniquely convinced by experts, I'm not sure we experts are the ones doing the communication with regular old people. Secondly, note that I'm not even sure why people care about experts this much, right? Presumably, they claim that these are issues that like touch your soul specifically, that like have an impact on your life directly. Why do you need an expert to tell you what to care about? I think people just know this for themselves. Thirdly, note you still make people feel profoundly powerless on your side when you talk about these issues of backsliding, right? You make people feel like their voice doesn't matter because increasingly it doesn't. Increasingly, this government is buying votes, is bypassing the judiciary, is bypassing the legislature. We think that pushing these issues out into public view is bad because it makes people feel like they're meaningless, like their vote doesn't mean anything. It makes them unlikely to politically participate. Fourthly, on fear. Notice for their side to manifest, you need like a lot of rhetoric. You need to portray this leader as authoritarian, and you likely link him to other previous authoritarian leaders, right? So as much as people don't like democracy, they still don't want to have their skulls crushed in a pavement. They still don't want to feel like because this leader is so authoritarian, because this leader hates the people so much, they'll like putting themselves at some physical risk by going to these protests. This is what they lead to on their side. Notice the weighing here. Even if they have perfect knowledge of these issues, and like a feeling of that these issues are solvable, and furtherly even prove to that these people know the exact solution, insofar as they feel it's too dangerous for them to engage politically, we're unsure how they can manifest their impacts on protesting. And just lastly, notice they raise the barrier to political action greatly in this debate, because this isn't just a policy change like passing a law. This is removing an aspiring dictator, removing his aspirations to power. I think this is just too big of a bite for the average person to chew. But fine, let's grant them this. Let's say they do have a protest. Why do they still make the situation worse? Notice the spiral mechanism they never respond to on our side. These are fundamentally ungrantable requests for these leaders to give out. You're asking them to give up power. You're asking them to potentially go to jail when the next administration replaces them. You're asking them to potentially lose their entire political career and remain like in a memory of shame for the entire country. This is not something that they'll be able to grant on their side. And notice the strategic observation here. They partially grant us these impacts in O2 when they say that these leaders are so afraid of these protests. They have good reason to be afraid. We're absolutely in agreement. What's the comparative here? On natural reasons to change them, we have 3 of them, they only responded to 1. First of all, on the external pressure. To hear them respond, okay, external pressure doesn't really matter because you just perceive or like portray the external enemy as an enemy of your state, as an enemy to the public. We don't think this really matters at the point where we recognize that external pressure is relevant because it makes the lives of your citizens tangibly worse, because it gives you sanctions, it makes their food more expensive. They still does have an incentive to replace you even if they view them as an enemy. Secondly, notice the internal betrayal mechanism. There are just people close to you within your party. They can also defect and just like portray themselves as a better alternative to you, that'll be less dictatorial, that'll be a better leader. And thirdly, notice there's just a time on our side. These leaders get old, their political dynasties die out, they become politically irrelevant, they get replaced with like younger, fresher faces on our side, something they remove with the spiraling mechanism, turning these countries into complete dictatorships. They also just have a point of broad response, saying, you can just rig real elections. Notice my housekeeping disproves this. And secondly, they say, but people just don't really realize why these issues are so bad for them. Notice this is intention when they say that, but on our side, everyone knows that backsliding is bad for them. Everyone knows that backsliding has negative impacts. Thus, everyone opposes it. That's how they're supposedly able to rally everyone. So which is the proposition? You have to choose one. Before my next class, I'll take a POI.
So your solution is to just cross our fingers and hope that things turn out well in the future and not do anything?
First of all, panel, notice so you can listen to a POI fully and then respond to it. Secondly, yes, we've given you 3 extraneous mechanisms where it's absolutely possible and likely that these like quasi-dictatorships or quasi-like authoritarian leaders just become politically irrelevant over time because they're also just bad leaders and they're like otherwise they wouldn't want to have these like dictatorial aspirations. They would just get voted in because they're bad leaders. They like to just get voted out after a few administrations on our side either. Second question on passing policies. I want to get to three broad responses our proposition gives us in this debate. First of all, they tell us these policies aren't majoritarian, so that they're unlikely to get passed. Several responses here because they ignore all of our content. First of all, they sometimes just are majoritarian. You can have policies about poverty. You can have policies about just social things like healthcare that affect all or most people in a country. Secondly, even if they're not majoritarian, there's still groups. Feminist policies affect women, which are still like at least half of the country in every country. Presumably they're politically relevant enough group of politicians to act on them. And thirdly, notice you still want to avoid the inherent damages of protests that they put on your image. Secondly, they call it this supposed tension in our case, where how can we claim that protests are impossible on their side, but possible on our side? Notice the key different panel. These are grantable respects, like grantable requests for aspiring authoritarians, right? They can grant you a law on abortion and it doesn't remove their power. They can grant you a law on women's rights and it doesn't remove your power. They cannot free up judiciary that will throw them into jail the next election. And thirdly, just notice the key point here, even if proposition's case is perfect and they're able to remove the dictator, these groups lose their supporters in the new country, right? Why? Because they necessarily abandon them. They switch their perspective from being the pro-female, from being the pro-gay, from being the pro-whatever party in this country to being the anti-dictator party. So they lose their core following from these like marginalized groups. They're unlikely to be able to manifest impacts for them. For all of these reasons, panel, I beg you, vote opposition.
Thank you, and I invite the opposition to reply.
Three, two, one. Two questions in the speech. Firstly, who gets policies passed? Secondly, who gets the democratic government? But before that, what does this government that we're talking about actually look like? We're telling you that this is a government that wants to be a dictatorship, so they will never make concessions that lose them that power, because that's never in their long-term interest. But they're still not full on dictatorships. This means they can be thrown out in next elections if they lose their popularity, and they don't still control the media and people's knowledge. The implication of this point is that people know about the backsliding going on, or at least the people on the outside know that. First question then on policy change. Notice the only proposition in response to our whole argument is, but the majority cares about these issues. Notice this is unimportant insofar as no one protests for it, so this isn't seen as something seen as an important issue. So the government has no reason to change that policy. But also, we explained to you why government on our house gives concessions to these people, and also notice proposition concedes this when they talk about on their house why government caves into their responses. These mechanisms are symmetric, so the government is likely to give these concessions, regardless of if they're popular in the majority or not. So we get these policies passed. Crucially, propositions comparative about them never passing the policy because people don't see a need, because they lost their political momentum, was never responded to. I want to then trade off. Why is it okay to have backsliding for a little bit longer in order to get all of these policies passed? Because notice they impact and benefit people on an everyday level. They benefit their lives. This looks like women granting the right to have abortion. They're not needing to go to illegal doctors. Poor people having more social security, having more affordable housing, so they don't have to spend a bunch of money on housing, not being able to afford food. All of these things that impact the person on an average level. That's why we're okay with trading off a government in power for a bit longer, and that's not necessarily good. Second question then, on who gets the government out. we tell you, like our key premise here is that this is likely symmetric on both sides of the house because of just like outside factors that aren't necessarily tied to protesting. About how these people just necessarily die out, they lose their popularity. The external factors kick in, like outside factors force them to change power, or like they just have internal struggles for power. All of these things went little to respond to, especially the inside factors and time factors. How does the opposition get this government out quicker? Firstly, we tell you they have no people protesting, because even if these protests affect you, even if something affects me, I won't go out and protest insofar as I think nothing can actually change, and I'm scared of backlash, right? Like Trump's presidency is affecting me, but I won't go out and protest because I know I alone can't achieve anything. Secondly, we tell you, even if people do protest, government necessarily cannot cave in on their side of the house, because caving in literally means resigning for the government. They can never do this, even if they lose their popularity. But thirdly, we give you a flip here, right? Like proposition gives these leaders a need to like capture power much quicker on their side of the house, because they are scared of losing power once they see these protesters going out on the street. Notice this mechanism was never responded to. I'll just explain why it's the worst thing to happen to proposition. Why? Because then dictatorship happens. That's the point when you capture the media. That's the point when you capture the judiciary. That's the point when you rig elections, buy out votes, and do all of these things. That's the point when you cannot do anything to the government. All of our mechanisms, like our three mechanisms, don't apply to these sorts of government, right? Time doesn't work because yes, you die, but your son is the next in line. There's no external pressure. There's no internal pressure because you captured all of the power. That's the worst thing to happen on their side of the house, because they get all of the harms of the people being dictators, but even worse because they can never be removed. This is the worst thing to happen, so please oppose.
Thank you, and I'd like to toss it.
Panel, these politicians, as long as they remain in power, will achieve democratic backsliding, and I think the longer you give them the time to do so, the more democratic backsliding occurs and the more irreversible the change, right? I think there's broadly 3 points I'd like to discuss in my speech. Firstly, on who actually fixes democratic backsliding. Secondly, on the goals of these social movements and who gets them more. But then thirdly, on independently, what are the negative impacts that are caused by this democratic backsliding itself, and where do we see this mostly mitigated? So firstly, on fixing, I think it is quite clear that we have a higher chance of fixing democratic backsliding when we tell you firstly that democratic backsliding is something that takes time. The more time you give these politicians in power, the more effective, the more changes they can make to the law, the more changes they can make to the system, the more likely democratic backsliding is about to occur. They tell us that, oh no, opposing these politicians will give them a sense of urgency. But I think, panel, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter because we aren't in a dictatorship, right? I think when they tell us that crackdowns on protests will occur, that they will try and seize the judiciary, it won't happen for precisely the reason that they tell us that we're not on a full-in dictatorship, right? I think when they do crackdowns on protests, media will start heavily reporting on that because that's something attention-grabbing, so people will pay attention to, and therefore what we see is that people are convinced even faster that what the government is doing is incorrect, or what the government is losing control of the situation, right? I think what this means is that when you have these protests, when you have these crackdowns, when you try to urgently capture all of the agencies, it doesn't work because we aren't in a dictatorship yet. I think the only case in which it'll work is if we are near a dictatorship in which the government has almost full control of every single thing, and that's how they're able to capture things entirely fast in one election cycle. This is a huge tension in their case that they never explain. But then secondly, I think what they try to tell us that people won't care about protests because they don't somehow they don't realize somehow they don't think that it's important. But I think I've already and that there are other incentives for not caring about protests. But they themselves mention that people already internally know about this. They already care about this. So I think this doesn't make sense on the perspective. And I think it doesn't necessarily. I think our side, we don't necessarily need a protest. Need these majoritarian groups to protest as well, right? I think what we need is to convince them, is to get the message out. Our side is all about the fact that having these civil rights groups on advocating for and critiquing democratic backsliding, meaning that they're putting a megaphone on what is happening right now, on what is it that they're seeing, and why is it that it matters. We tell you that people are unaware of what they're seeing, are unaware of why it matters, and that is why democratic backsliding occurs, right? And that is why we see much more in our case. They mention things such as bad leaders. They mention things such as natural electoral incentives. But I think all of this is symmetrical, right? I think this happens on our side. However, panel, notice how on our side we're able to take these governments out faster. We're able to increase pressure on these governments, making them reconsider their actions. And then secondly, on their factual goals, I think even if you think all of this is symmetrical, I think simply because by having these movements advocate for an issue that affects everyone, you gain social capital, just means that you're able to achieve all of these goals you want more effectively. So even if the above is symmetrical, we still win because we still generate more delta than them. Finally then, on exactly what is it on the checks and balances, right? I think at the end of the day, even if we don't care, even if we think everything is symmetrical, right, panel, I think at the end of the day, what we see is that on their side, they need luck and they need time to wait it out. I think all of this time means that when you have corruption, when you have these bad impacts, they still occur. We still prefer a world in which less time is taken. Thank you.